Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Manara Podcast. I'm joined with Khubaib and Zan. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about something very relevant with what's going on in current events with regards to Palestine and going into a bit of the history of the region, of the history of Zionism, what it is, its objectives, how it came about, and as well as uh, I suppose, the nature of Zionism and how it ties into very much Orientalism and Orientalist tropes as well. So it's very much, I think, going to be an enlightening conversation and something that is probably something that not as many people know about that region as well. So I think a good kind of starting point to dive into it, especially because Zionism as a term is maybe not too well understood either in this day and age, and tends to be immediately conflated with Judaism or anti-Semitism and so on. So yeah, I guess like for yourself, Khobeib, do you want to kick us off? Just an intro into Zionism, what the term means, and what kind of the objectives of the Zionist project is.
Yes. So to give the historical background, first of all, Zionism is sometimes claimed to be a very ancient ideology, and that so long as Jews have existed, Zionism has also existed. But this is, of course, a very obvious myth. Zionism, as we understand it today, which is a political form of Zionism, at least, came into existence in the maybe between in the latter half of the 19th century, and specifically it came into being as we see it today in 1897 at the Basel conference, which is where the Zionist organization, which later became the World Zionist Organization, was established there, and it decided that the goals of Zionism were the establishment of a Jewish homeland somewhere. So the tenets, I guess we could say, of Zionism as established then were the propagation of the idea that the Jews were a nation, were one people. This wasn't something that really existed before. You had Jewish populations across the world, but I don't think that you had this idea that the Jews were one people, an ethnic nation, in the sense that we do have that Zionism sought to establish, and really what that conception echoes is very much the maybe the Darwinian or the Darwinist, I should say, sentiment of the time, which wanted to make everything about biology and genetics and so on. And it's actually, of course, as we know, something that maybe later Nazism really took from in defining what a Jew is. They took a biological kind of pseudo-scientific approach to what a Jew is, and this is very much what the Zionists seem to have agreed with. Maybe not in the early period, but certainly after the establishment of the State of Israel, where it wasn't sufficient for you to come along and declare that you're a Jew in order to be recognized as such. No, you had to establish that you were born of a Jewish mother and so on. So yes, it was about establishing the idea that the Jews are a nation, and also working towards creating this national consciousness, and furthermore working towards the kind of gathering of Jews everywhere in one place, where they will form a majority and create basically a Jewish state, which is the name of the book that Theodor Herzl wrote in 1896, 1 year before he called forth the Basel Conference. And at that time, they had not quite decided on Palestine. Actually, they were quite open to where it could be. the prospect of Argentina was opened, like any kind of empty place in Argentina. Uganda too.
Uganda and Madagascar are the two I've heard as well.
Yeah, I think Madagascar was. I'm not sure if it was considered in the early period, but certainly there were ideas that the Nazis floated for settling the Jews in Madagascar. But in the early period, Argentina and Uganda definitely were considered, and of course Palestine was the other. And Palestine was maybe favored due to the historical and cultural and religious ties that could easily be established. But the fact that they considered other territories shows that it wasn't really about the significance of the land as such. It was more so about establishing a homeland for Jewish people, settling any area in the world, and creating this this colony. And that really is where we can see the settler colonial nature of Zionism coming into play. And sorry. So that's Zionism. And what we see actually in the Zionist discourse about the way in which they would go about establishing their homeland is this very European outlook, and one that very much taps into the kind of Orientalist discourse that was very much present in Europe at the time. There was this idea that the Zionists would need to ingratiate themselves to a great power in order to establish their nation state. And in order to do that, of course, they tapped into many kind of Orientalist tropes, or not even tapped into. They were part of the European milieu, which produced and operated within that Orientalist framework. But maybe more on that a bit later.
Yeah, no, just like but I think you touched on a few important things about the genealogy of Zionism, which we need to be stressed. One is that it was formed in the 19th century during the height of European colonialism. It had that sort of that connection, that ideology, that milieu, that it really informed it, and it's one of the reasons why they didn't really need to be too worried about where they went outside of Europe, because anywhere outside of Europe was seen as, without culture. It was barren. It was ripe for the taking, which is the attitude of European colonists, and it trickled down into sort of bourgeoisie and proletariat attitudes in Europe. And a great example is that, like you said, Theodore Herzl was strongly considering Argentina as well. I have a quote from him here. He specifically identified Argentina as being attractive because it's got natural resources, is large in size, with a small population and a temperate climate. It was just textbook colonial attitudes. Where can we go that we can have a good life? And obviously they ended up settling in on Palestine. And again, that was with a complete lack of consideration for the indigenous people, because you don't really need to be worried about indigenous people when you have the mindset of a European colonist. So that attitude is really important, I suppose, to identify it. And the second thing, like you said as well, is that connection to great powers. Theodore Herzl was writing letters to the Ottoman Sultan, hoping that he'd do the Jews a favor. But that didn't work out too well. But it's, again, I think it's something to highlight that Zionism has always been intimately related to and almost always intimately needed the backing of great powers to exist. And that's something that's remained up until now. And there was a third thing you mentioned in terms of which was important. One, its relation to great powers, the nature of its connection to European colonialism. There was and I think the last thing is that just how intimately related it is just to the modern period. The idea of Jewish nationalism was just alien to a lot of Jews. If you were some Jew in Iraq, you spoke Arabic, your name was Ibrahim. What's some Polish guy talking about colonizing. What's that got to do with you? The entire concept of Zionism just changed the face of the Jewish identity in the 19th and 20th and 21st up until now. It's this ethnocentric idea of Judaism, this nationalistic conception of Judaism. It's again a very Eurocentric conception of Judaism. You don't imagine black Ethiopian Jews or Iraqi Arab Jews. You imagine Jews as like a white person, like Ben Stiller, or like Jack Black, someone like that, and it's how the fact that it was intimately related to the Enlightenment, scientific conceptions of race, nationalism. All of these things are fundamentally quite corrosive, and it's had a corrosive effect on Jewish nationalism, which became Zionism, and just for anyone else in contact with such a harmful set of ideas,
Yeah, and to extract actually 2 points. You mentioned, of course, that Herzl was very much interested in Argentina due to the low population that he identified, and of course that takes us back to a tenet of Zionism that I forgot to mention, which is the idea that in this Jewish national home or in this Jewish state, the Jews must be a majority. They cannot exist as a minority. They cannot exist at parity with any pre-existing populations. They must constitute a majority, and they must maintain that majority by any means. They must establish it, of course, through migration and so on, and also and Herzl talks about this even as early as his book, The Jewish State, by spiriting away the local population by any means possible, enticing them maybe through economic means or by any other means. And perhaps many at least have traced the Zionist idea of transfer to this period. And of course, transfer is a
synonym.
Exactly, it's a euphemism for perhaps something more sinister, which we have seen again and again when it comes to Zionism, and which is perhaps a trend or an established tenet of any settler colonial endeavor, which is the destruction or removal by any means of the pre-existing indigenous populations. So that's number one, the mass of population. And the other thing you mentioned is, of course, the interaction between Zionism and Judaism. And of course, what we often tend to find, well, not tend to find, but historically speaking, when the Zionists started immigrating to Palestine, there was an immediate clash of cultures between them and the pre-existing Jewish population of Palestine, the indigenous Jewish population. The indigenous Jewish population of Palestine, which is called the old Yishuv, the old population, if you will. They were generally quite conservative. They were religious. They were observant Jews. If any of them had over time migrated to Palestine, it was for religious reasons rather than nationalistic reasons. And this population was culturally assimilated, if you will, to Palestine. They spoke Arabic. They were culturally Arab in many ways. They shared in the festivals and social occasions and affairs of the Christian and Muslim population of historic Palestine. Whereas the Zionists, who started trickling in from around 1882, that's the first Aliyah, they were secular. They were quite ideologically committed to the idea of establishing a political nation state. They didn't really consider Judaism to be a religion for them as such. It wasn't so much a religion for them; it was an identity and an ethnicity in line with Zionist conceptions of what constitutes a Jew. And so yes, no, there was an immediate clash between between the different cultures. Moreover, the Zionists didn't try to integrate into the local population. They had no interest in that. They weren't here to become Arab or to tap into some kind of ancient identity that they'd lost because they'd gone to Europe and lost that. No, they weren't there for that. They were there to establish a European outpost, which was in every way European in this land, and they had no great interest in the ways of the local population.
Yeah, it's often overlooked that even the fact that you had that indigenous Jewish population, very much conservative Jewish, whereas most Zionists aren't necessarily religious. A lot of them are atheists. They don't even necessarily believe in God or practice in any way or shape or form practice Judaism. Even the language of Hebrew is not it's not the language of their texts and so on. That's not the traditional Jewish language. So much of it is actually, as you said, in contrast to Judaism and practicing Jews, and yet you see the terminology used together. Like if you're in any way against Zionism, you're seen labeled immediately as anti-Semitic, and often history is used, like pointing to the 3,000 years ago, the Jews at that time, as a reason for Zionists being indigenous to that land and therefore having some sort of ownership over that land, despite it, as both of you have highlighted, it being a very modern European project. It's part of very much the propaganda you see to try and make it European, but at the same time appeal to history and use religion and so on when it's beneficial to their motives.
Absolutely, and maybe it might actually be beneficial to take a bit of a dive into this very European element of the very European nature of Zionism, and of course the attitudes towards non-Europeans, because what becomes immediately clear is their internalization of many kind of Orientalist conceptions of the Arab, of the non-European, and even maybe the internalization of things we've talked about maybe in previous podcasts, such as the idea of progress and so on.
I guess the idea of the creation of the new Jew is intimately, which is an important Zionist idea, is intimately linked to the idea of progress. That we have to we're going to move to Israel. We're going to be European colonists, and we're going to get rid of the old Jew. The old Jew is Oriental. He's religious. He's but with the new Jew is modern and progressive, and very much just Europeanized, enlightened, productive. Very material European conceptions of what it means to be civilized and human. Yeah.
No, the very idea of the sabra, the new Jew is the sabra, that this individual who has shed the weak Jew, the ritually committed Jew, and so on, and has shed all that, and of course embraced modernity. Embrace modernity how? By becoming European in every way, by establishing the state, by working and working the earth, and all of these ideas about what it means to be a modern person, in industrializing and so on.
It's very disturbing.
Even in maybe the very appearance of the new Jew vis-a-vis the old Jew, you see some very unfortunately maybe anti-Semitic tropes coming to the fore, where the new Jew is almost always this blonde, blue-eyed kind of figure, strong and almost an Ubermensch, the Superman, whereas the old Jew is this kind of weak, cowardly figure. There's even in some literature, to a certain degree, the very idea of the old Jew as the one who was capable of being killed in the Holocaust, whereas the new Jew is one who is strong and is able to defend himself and so on. And so there is a great degree of maybe contempt the old Jew and a desire to create something new, something European. But sorry, Zan,
No, just totally agree with you. How how disturbing the ideology and origins of a lot of Zionist tropes are. There's a quote here from the book I have. The Myths of Liberal Zionism, Yitzhak Lauer, and he even says that that Zionists accepted 19th century hatred towards Jews. They internalized anti-Semitism. They agree that the Jews are non-productive, non-enlightenment, backwards, and not fully human, and so we're lacking humanity because we're lacking Europeanness, and so we have to modernize ourselves. And this manifests in so many Eurocentric ways in their society. The normal accent in Israel is the Ashkenazi accent, which is obviously the accent of the European Jews. Like you were saying, the beauty standards are Eurocentric. The all their most I think they prefer to send blondes to their beauty pageants and into acting and into media. It's a very European conception of a Europeanized society and European conception of what it means to be a Jew in the current age. So it's again very just overall genealogically Eurocentric.
Yeah, and I know you don't like anecdotes much, Zan, but I need to having given this kind of theoretical framework. I do remember when I was still studying at university, I did a course on Israel and Palestine, and of course we had a number of Israelis in the class.
You.
And I remember in one of the classes, I mentioned maybe Haredi Jews or something to that effect. Of course, these are like traditional Jews who keep to the tenets of the Jewish faith. And I was extremely shocked because one of the Jewish girls in the class immediately expressed great contempt for even the idea of Haredis, and said things that had they been said by somebody else, I would have immediately labeled as quite anti-Semitic. The idea that they're smelly, they're disgusting, they live in the medieval period. And she said this in a class out loud, and no one really thought to that it was unacceptable or what have you. And to this day, I remember it, and I was extremely shocked at the time. But what can you say when a Jew is being is tapping into truths that you?
I know, right? Yeah, it's like having a liberal Muslim coworker going out for alcohol and you standing there looking like a potato, not going out, but making the rest of us look bad. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that really does reflect the internalization of the European outlook towards the Jew.
Oh, 100%. Even there's like small, not small things, but even for example, the sort of there's been like almost terraforming on ecological terraforming of Palestine or the land that Israel has taken over. That 90% of trees there, for example, are European conifers. Because all those European Jews want to be reminded of home, which isn't there. And how it's like. You're more likely to get skin cancer as an Israeli than as a Palestinian because 30 or 40% of the population are just European origin. So of course you're not you're going to experience problems when you're not indigenous like that. But yeah, there's all these little elements.
The matter like this changing of the landscape in order, of course, because the Zionist project is about creating a European outpost. And so they have to do so in every way, both by of course planting European trees, by renaming the land into something that's familiar and biblical, and so on. Wherever they can give themselves the impression that they're actually in Europe rather than in the Middle East, in the midst of the Arab world. They do it. Which, quite ironically, I would say, only deepens the fact that they are foreign to this land, because people who are indigenous don't want to hide the identity and really force the land to submit. No, they know it. They're familiar with it, with its fauna and flora, and they're part of it. They don't fight it.
No, that's right. It was always just an attempt to create like a little piece of Europe, almost a European colony in the Middle East. I've a quote here from Theodor Herzl. He even described what a potential Israeli state would look like. He said that it would be a bulwark against Asia. We would be the advanced post of civilization against barbarism. We'd be a neutral state, and we would remain in constant touch with all of Europe, which would guarantee our existence. And what Maxime Rodinson says about this quote here, from what I'm reading, is that it would have been difficult to place Zionism any more clearly within the framework of European imperialist policies. It just intimately tied in terms of, like you were talking about, the idea of transfer. It was always intimately connected to the idea of transfer, which is just ethnic cleansing of an indigenous population, of creating European society, secular, modern, progressive. It's just really important, I guess, to note how just consistently throughout the genealogy and evolution of Zionism, there's obviously so many different branches. The religious Zionism and socialist Zionism and liberal Zionism, and I don't know if they have a provisional Zionism the same way we have a provisional IRA, but we'll see anyway. But yeah, just it's always been Eurocentric and quite progressive and European.
Yeah. And it might be worth pausing here and reflecting on one of the areas of similarity between Zionism as a settler colonial enterprise and the one that comes to mind to me is American colonialism. And maybe I mentioned this to Abir earlier. First of all, when you look at a lot of Zionist literature of the early period, that's like before 1948, a great degree of it is very kind of Zionist centric. It focuses on what the Zionists are doing in Palestine, what they aim to do, their colonization enterprises, how successfully they are buying out land and the farms and settlements that they are building. There is at no point, like you can read a 200-page book, for instance, prepared by the Jewish National Fund or before 1948 or any such Zionist work. And if you read it, you do not get the impression that there is any other population at all. You get the impression that this is a completely empty land, and they're just like they're doing their thing in this land without a people. You honestly would not believe reading these books that the Arabs, the Christians, and the Palestinians are the majority of the population throughout this period, even until 1948. In 1948, the Jews did not constitute more than a third of the population, and this was an extreme growth compared to what they were in 1914. In 1914, I think they were around 56,000, whereas the total population was maybe close to 700,000. So just less than a tenth. And so throughout this period, they're talking about the land of Palestine and the process of colonization without any real regard for the indigenous population that exists. And so what you see here is an attempt at a dissociation between the land and the people who exist on the land. Of course, Zionism was very much interested in taking the land. It wasn't very much interested in the local population or keeping it. And I've come across texts both from pre-1948 and of course post, where there is this further attempt to dissociate the Palestinians from the land of Palestine by saying, for instance, the Arabs are Bedouins. They're all nomadic. They don't really work the land. The land was neglected. They all came from Egypt when Muhammad Ali Pasha invaded Egypt, and all of these kind of myths. And you see the same with American colonialism. settler colonialism, where they try to paint this picture of the Native American as a nomad who has no regard for the land, who has no attachment to the land, and so
That's right.
The entirety of America is by nature the right of the white man, the American. It doesn't matter if you displace the Native American because the land is not his, and you have this very same kind of ideological framework that really moves Zionism.
Like this mythology, like in America they called it manifest destiny. We have to keep moving our border, our frontier all the way west, and until we own this land. It's very similar, I guess. And again, both obviously, the American colonization, North American, Israel. It's all about displacing and ethically cleansing the indigeneity, removing any evidence of their existence, and right up until they're gone. Now we can have some sort of fake admiration and call our have a few place names like Mississippi that refers to them, but it's just after the fact.
And what actually this gives rise to, of course, this ignoring the population which already exists and has existed for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and dissociating it from at least in the mind of the Zionists, from the land, is it sets you up very nicely for displacement of the population. That's how you lay the ideological foundations for ethnic cleansing, and not just ethnic cleansing, but what we're seeing now, which is genocide. The idea that by all means possible, the indigenous population has to be removed, destroyed, or whatever it is. It doesn't really matter what the process becomes. It's about the removal of the indigenous population, and that's where we see settler colonialism turning into, or the settler colonial ideology of Zionism naturally leading it towards genocidal acts. Of course, so we can say the nation state itself can be genocidal because it aims towards homogeneity, but settler colonialism has another element which naturally leads it towards genocide, particularly in the case of Zionism, I would say, because from the outset, it was they had this as a tenet within the ideology, which is that the Jews must always constitute a majority, and the land of Palestine is the inheritance of the Jewish people, as the Zionists defined them.
So, do you think it's worth them discussing now, I guess, the nature of how Orientalism and knowledge has been weaponized against the Palestinians in order to facilitate this settler colonial project? Is it worth now dipping into this? And
I think that would be a good way to take this, actually.
Excellent. Go ahead.
I guess this means that we just need to take a deeper dive into the way in which Zionism writes about the Palestinian, how knowledge production, particularly I would say, even before Zionism was emerged as an ideology, you had a huge number of surveys that were conducted of Palestine by the British and so on, and this all contributed to the creation of this myth about Palestine as this biblical landscape. The British would go around Palestine and they would find random villages and they would attach biblical names to them, and so that contributed, I guess, to the creation of this idea of a biblical landscape of Palestine, which, when the Zionists came along, and actually even post 1948, when the State of Israel was established, you had this very same idea of this Orientalist body of work being taken and then being applied to the geography of Palestine. So villages that were ethnically cleansed, or the locations of those villages would be renamed according to the biblical surveys that were conducted by the British before them. So you see very much a continuity between Orientalist modes of knowledge production and how they interact with power once first the British and then the Zionists were in power.
Netanyahu has sorry, just to jump in. Netanyahu, just from what you were saying, it reminded me. He used the example of the people of Amalek. When he
Yeah.
spoke a few months ago as a justification to basically destroy the Palestinians and lay them to ruin, essentially. Again, biblical reference used to justify their genocide that they're enacting against Palestinians. Trying to paint the Jews and Christians. It's an effort of Jews and Christians against the Muslims, which is often something we see very, very commonly, especially when you look at the relationship of Israel, America, Britain, and so on. They try and use that Judeo-Christian link, which is very, very much farcical, really, because we know how Zionists really feel about Christianity. They don't truly respect it as a faith or its believers.
100%. I think it'd be really useful to define Orientalism now, I guess, and it's actually a bit of a methodological problem in Edward Said's book Orientalism, where he defines it in multiple ways. But I guess there's two elements to the concept, which, when we define them, we can see how they're intimately related to how the Palestinians are treated and how the Israelis operate. So there's the knowledge element of Orientalism, which is creating the narrative or that body of knowledge about the Orient, about Muslims, about Palestinians. It reduces them, dehumanizes them, often demonizes them, and oftentimes it legitimizes the processes of colonialism. Now that we've brought this area into our body of knowledge, it almost creates the legitimizing force for now we can control it. It's in our imagination. And that obviously brings me to the second point of Orientalism, which is almost just, the tools, the methods, just the implementation of power. Oftentimes, Orientalists were also just colonists. They were, like Hobe, we were saying, they were doing surveys, gathering information, putting together the information to actually do hard colonialism and take over land. It was one of the most famous Orientalists of all time was obviously Lord Cromer, who was a colonist in both India and Egypt. He was in India first, and they were like, "Oh, well, you've got such great experience of the Orient. We can just chuck you over here, hundreds, thousands of miles away in Egypt, and you'll probably be just as useful because it's the Orient. It's just this one big body of reduced, acultural non-civilization, And so it's important to understand, okay, how the European implementation of knowledge and power is intimately related in the modern period, and most obviously seen through in the body of work known as Orientalism, and this is obviously weaponized against Palestinians today. They're seen as they're backwards and not productive, and they're Arabs and they're simple and whatever other nonsense or lies. Whereas on the other hand, the Zionist Jew has come and he's productive and modern and progressive, and more worthy and deserving of the land, and it's very much just something that has been happening for hundreds of years as part of colonialism, and that's why all the great Orientalists were the British and the French, because they were the great colonists of the Orient. And now I guess we're seeing the inheritors of the British and French Orientalists in America and Israel using the same tools, using the same weapons of dehumanization and alienation to justify all sorts of barbarity against the Palestinian people. And it's just, I guess, important to appreciate that this tradition, these methods are hundreds of years old, and it's a shock that that people are there, they're listening to the news, buying up all sorts of crap, that there are 36 hospitals in Gaza and every single one of them is a Hamas base. It just doesn't make any sense. It's just, but they can believe it because they have so little respect for the humanity of the Palestinians, and so it's just really important to note these things. And I know I'm going on for a while, but one thing that Edward Said does mention he's not demonizing the possibility of knowledge of other peoples, but he says one of the fundamental attributes of healthy knowledge production about another people. If you want to go learn about Japan, because you like anime or whatever else, you want to learn about another country. He says one of the fundamental attributes of a healthy knowledge production is the absence of coercion, the absence of of being able to employ force. And he says what makes Orientalist knowledge is that it was done from a place of European dominance over the Orient, Asia, the Middle East, and we're seeing that same methodological issue up until now. If that domination exists, then knowledge suddenly has to serve power, and that's obviously not the sort of reasonable, healthy manifestation of knowledge we want to be seeing, both in Palestine and for Muslims, but anywhere in the world. But there's my big long rant about why Orientalism sucks.
Yeah, it's that classic idea, I suppose, that we're enlightened Europeans. We can think rationally and logically, which we know you Orientals can't do. So therefore, we know what is best for you. We've read, we know your culture, we know your land, we know your people, and you see similar arguments as well used like in the whole, I guess, discussion of a peace process between Palestine and Israel. That if Israel stopped doing what they were doing in terms of their military action and taking of settlements, as if you can't trust the Palestinians then in that position, that they would just go crazy, they'd go rampant, attack Israel, do whatever. All this kind of idea, Hamas would take over. That's often the narrative you see, as if the onus, therefore, can only be on Israel and the Zionists, because all the European, they're the ones that can act rationally. They're not Hamas.
That's right.
So therefore, the peace process and resolving this issue of their own creation, we should leave that to them. We can't trust the natives because they're the barbaric natives.
Yep, well said.
I would actually say that the logic of Orientalism, or the representations that Orientalism created within the European mind, were essential for the logic of Zionism to be acceptable to anybody. Because one of the key ways in which Orientalism orientalizes non-Europe is by placing it outside time. So it does not exist in the Orient, and in the same way that the British were able to go to Palestine and conduct all of these surveys, they weren't conducting surveys of the existing population. They had maybe they did a bit of that, but their primary interest was in this biblical archaeology of the land. So they did not think that history had passed at all. There was no history between the Bible and modern Palestine at the time, and that gives itself very easily to the Zionist narrative, or the Zionist logic of re-establishing a Jewish state in Palestine. Because if you're of the view that there has been no history in Palestine since the kingdoms of David and Solomon, or since the Roman period and so on, then it's very sensible for you to re-establish a Jewish state there, because it was only yesterday that the Romans I guess dispersed this revolt or that revolt and dispersed the Jews from Palestine. But if you don't take that Orientalist approach and actually look at the fact that history has passed, you've got 2,000 years of history in Palestine. You had the Romans and the Sassanians, and you had the Rashidun and the Umayyads and the Abbasids, and then you had all the kingdoms that came after the fracture of the Abbasid Empire, and then you had the Turks and the Crusaders and the Mamluks, so you have history happening in Palestine. But you take the Orientalist methodology and that results in this Zionist approach, which can just remove that completely and make it seem logical to the human mind that 2,000 years later you can come along and re-establish a state. I mean, if we applied that same logic to some places which were previously occupied by Muslims, I don't think anyone would accept it by any means. If we knew, if the three of us sat together and wrote a declaration saying that we view with favor the re-establishment of a Muslim state in Spain, I think most people would laugh at us. And that wasn't so long ago. That was only 500, 600 years ago that Muslims had a presence there. But somehow it is logical because of Orientalist representations of the Orient for it to be sensible to establish a Zionist state in Palestine.
No, 100%. And I guess like what you're describing points to this almost exceptionalism when it comes to Orientalism, where the methods of other social sciences evolved, but Orientalism was always playing catch up to a certain extent because the way it abstracted and reduced the Orient was just beneficial and useful to the brokers of power, and so it was almost like this legitimacy to this methodological weakness in Orientalism, which exists up until now, oftentimes, I think, in conversations about the Middle East, even though they don't call it that body of knowledge or, Oriental studies anymore. Stories of the Middle East and stories of Islam are still almost, often have a methodological weakness that hasn't been strongly addressed in the West. And yeah, to what we were saying about how they can just skip 2,000 years worth of history, I guess that's just, one of the Orientalist methods is looking at things in their roots, looking at this and then using those roots or origins to come up with these grand theories and abstractions. One of the examples of this is how some Orientalists will say, for example, Al-Ghazali wrote a book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. And so they said, Al-Ghazali hated philosophy, and therefore the Muslim mind is anti-philosophy, anti-intellectual, because Al-Ghazali wrote this book, and now we're going to accuse him and all Muslims of this, of this grand idea. All Muslims are anti-intellectual because of this one book he wrote. So it's there's just always been like this methodological obsession with origins, and not even very almost like you were saying, methodological origins. A mythology behind the Jewish presence in Israel, Palestine, and the mythology of all sorts of ideas when it comes to the Orient and Muslims.
Yeah, and I think it was Abir who mentioned the use of the imagery of Amalek in recent discourse on the Palestinians in Gaza. And when we look at Netanyahu's discourse and of course Biden's discourse, and we mentioned this a little, the kind of black and white narrative we get, this idea that Israel is civilization, Israel is the light unto the nations, Israel is the force of good, the force of light, and so on, and the Palestinians and Hamas are the forces of darkness and evil and destruction and barbarity and so on. This very much taps into Orientalist representations, because of course there are two forms maybe of representations of the native that we see in Orientalist literature. There is what Zan already mentioned, the idea of the lazy native, the native who just is unable to do anything without European support, and so there's this paternalistic approach. But immediately, at any point, this native can also become a treacherous, evil, ungrateful thing, which will always bite the hand that feeds it. And so there's always this. It's impossible to win as a native, because when you are you are being compliant and good, well, you are lazy and you are inferior, and you must do as told, and that's your place. And when you are being a bad native, then you were being deceptive all along, and you were evil. And how deceived were we as the progressive European white man trying to help you. And you see this not just on discourse on Palestine. You see it even on Afghanistan. I think I might have mentioned this before. But the discourse on Afghanistan, and because Afghanistan has been invaded by European powers many times, you see this again and again. When you look at the historiography of Afghanistan from Alexander's time, Orientalist historiography is the idea of this kind of white Alexander marching into Afghanistan, trying to bring the light of civilization, only to return injured and dying in Babylon because the Afghan was vicious and ungrateful. And then you have this idea of the British in 1948 and again in the 1840s and in the 1870s, once again invading Afghanistan in order to bring the light of civilization and the white man's progress. But each time the Afghan was ungrateful and evil, and he shattered the British attempt at bringing light. And again, you see the same discourse when it comes to the American invasion. The idea that the Americans went and they were there for 20 years and they tried their best, but this Afghan is just impossible to civilize, and we had to leave. We had to leave, like bitten by this Afghan fox, who is just impossible to tame or civilize. And this same discourse, you can really see it across the board when it comes to representations of the native. Certainly in what we're seeing about the representations of Palestinians in Israeli and to a similar extent American discourse, and even European discourse on what happened on October 7th and beyond.
Yeah, with Afghanistan, I always find it interesting as well because, of course, it wasn't that long ago when you had the Soviets involved in that region, and at that time, if you were in America, you were thinking, "Oh, these Afghanis are great. You know, they're like rebelling, they're holding their own, they're fighting those dirty communists. You know, these are good lads. You know, good these mujahids are good. You know, I mean, they're even in film in Rambo. You have that. It's literally about them, and then you have at the end the message to all the brave mujahideen, which of course in recent times they removed that message they removed mujahideen from it. To make it more, I think they replaced it with the gallant Afghanis or something like that. But it's just funny how the discourse changes when it suits these nations and their agendas. Like very quickly, the way Afghanis were and these freedom fighters were portrayed. Well, they went from freedom fighters to terrorists very, very, very quickly.
Absolutely. So that's on I guess Orientalism and knowledge, the relationships between knowledge and power. I'm not sure if you had anything else you wanted to add on that, Zan. Yeah.
No, I think that's good on Orientalism. I think we've discussed it well. I guess it'd be just it'd be useful, I guess, to just discuss almost how there's a unique approach to Islam. Next.
Yes.
And I think something to note, which Edward Said mentions in his book Covering Islam, which I read recently, which I thought was really interesting, and I think it's really applicable, is that when people are talking about Muslims and Islam, it actually means completely different things in America than it does in like the Muslim world. That when they invoke Islam in America or Israel, it doesn't mean what we think it means. That they might as well just be saying Islam as synonymous with a foreign threat or an enemy. Whereas when we say it, we're thinking of like the civilization of Islam, and it's billions of people, almost 2 billion people, different ethnicities, languages, different legal schools and cultures, and so that that the approach to Islam still has so much like ingrained Orientalism in it, so much ingrained dehumanization and demonization, and that's really apparent right now with what's happening to the Palestinian people, and that one of the reasons why what's happening to them is possible is because the majority of them are Muslim, and that you get a unique treatment as a Muslim in when you're on the receiving end of Euro-American imperial processes. And again, this goes back to, I guess, the relationship between knowledge and power. It's because to a significant extent, sociologically, reality is received. This is what Edward Said says. He said that reality is received because you've never been to the Antarctica. You don't know never necessarily seen a polar bear. But we all believe the Antarctica exists. It's not like Mordor. There's polar bears there. I've never been to like North Korea, but it's probably there. But I was given that reality, by news and books and YouTube. And so, to a very large extent, different to us, because I think the three of us have been to the Middle East and, studied about Arabic and, been Muslim and worshipped Allah. So, we have like an actual experience of Islam, a lived experience. For most Americans, it's actually something that's a received reality. And for Americans and for like a lot of people in the West. And why that's very problematic is because a lot of times in the West, it's been in the interests of the media, the academia, consultants who make money, and the government all to come together and create their reality of what Islam means and what it means to be Arab and Palestinian, and that this sort of knowledge power complex that exists has a unique bias against Muslims and against obviously the Palestinians who are majority Muslim, and that up until now has been and will continue to create very harmful narratives. And you're seeing, this is one of the reasons, I guess, why you're seeing so much resistance from politicians and from media figures in the West against, against any sort of discussion about humanizing the Palestinians, or talking about a ceasefire even was considered, out of bounds, just because it's their traditional disposition against the Arabs and against the Muslims, and I suppose it's something that we have to acknowledge up until now, that sort of unique sort of complex of knowledge production has remained, I suppose, in operation up until now, with the media, the government, the academia. So yes, yeah. I've sort of gone on a bit here, but there's something very unique about the coverage of Muslims and Islam.
Yeah, the great irony perhaps here is that, I mean, Said himself in Orientalism notes that in studying the history of Orientalism and the way in which Orientalist knowledge is produced, he has found himself actually studying the history of this odd parallel to anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish hatred or anti-Jewish discourse and so on within the European mind. So the coverage of Islam in Orientalist literature, which has of course fed into modern depictions of the Muslim and so on, are very much related to the way in which the Jew was represented in Europe, perhaps before the 1940s and so on. And I just find that very ironic, because of course now we have Zionism, which is very much tapping into this coverage of Muslims, and it doesn't just depict Muslims in this. It doesn't only depict Palestinians in this way that you're talking about, Dan. But when it comes to Zionists in particular, it very much applies to even those Arabs they are normalizing with, such as those in the UAE and Saudi Arabia. There is this disdain and this depiction of them as they are the lazy version of the Arab, whereas the Palestinian is the violent. But in all cases, you cannot escape from this this sort of coverage. And Islam in particular, I imagine maybe that Americans are more capable of viewing it as a threat, because of course they have a history of this ideological warfare, if you will. They needed something to replace the communist threat, and Islam kind of found a very easy way of settling into that. Of course, that's post Soviet collapse. So Saeed was talking. He spent most of his life before that, and we still saw that depiction of the Muslim, the Arab, the Palestinian in particular, which very much tapped into Orientalist tropes. Yeah, I don't know. Because you've recently finished reading Covering Islam, right, Zan?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and it uses a lot of the Orientalist narratives, but again, it focuses a lot in on how there's a lot of unique coverage specifically about Islam, and how there's a lot of methodological weakness in the study and examination of Islam. He's obviously talking in the 20th century, so there's been changes up until now. But again, there's just, like, there are no really like proper, well-known public authorities of Islam who are reputable in America and in the West. Really, if you're going to talk, like, who would you go to? Like, because say like Wal Halak, for example, he no one knows who Wal Halak is outside of like Muslim circles. The average guy doesn't know who he is. He might be someone, for example, who's a very trustworthy source in America to talk about Islam, but no one's going to put him on the news, and yeah, up until now, there's just no real strong public figures who are well versed in Islam in Europe and America. Maybe like Edward Said was saying this in the 20th century. Maybe there's a few Muslim figures these days. A few more. People like Jonathan A.C. Brown, I guess, and you have institutes like the Keane Institute and whoever else. But again, just how prominent are they? How much do they actually have an influence on the narrative in American and Western life? About Muslims and Islam, and
Yeah, no, very very little. I imagine, and because. To return actually to the structural ways in which this knowledge about Muslims and Palestinians is produced. Of course, we no longer have Orientalism as a field, but we do have the vast area now of security studies and counterterrorism. And a lot of literature that's produced on Muslims and Islam tends to fall within that. You have all of these kind of American think tanks and what have you, which are funded by the American state, that produce this kind of self-reinforcing narrative about Muslims and Islam, which always comes at it from a security perspective. And then whenever there is any kind of crisis that emerges, you get all of these pundits who jump onto the TVs, who come from security and counterterrorism backgrounds and what have you, and they just repeat the same tropes which are present within the counterterrorism security kind of domain, and that's a very limited area. It doesn't seek to really understand Islam as such. It always studies it as a security risk, and the results you get reflect that very often.
No, 100%. Edward Said even says that there's almost like an unwritten consensus about what is acceptable to be said about Islam, and this is what he said obviously back in the 20th century, but it's true. Between media and consultants and security analysts and government, there's like an unspoken understanding almost of what is the acceptable range of things to be said, and again, it's just not useful, often reductive.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's a reason the wrong people get propagated, especially in America, like the likes of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who will talk about Islam as if she's any sort of authority figure on Islam, and like you said, Zan, I don't really think there is anyone else, like, in terms of prominence, like, just like the likes of, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, who's a prominent name, but even then, what I don't see him as having had much influence on how Islam is viewed in the U.S. or the public perception of Islam. Um, Again, as Muslims, we're aware of who he is, and that kind of fuels really the extent of it. We're familiar with or have heard of Zaytullah College, that kind of thing, but yeah, it seems very surface level still. Like, I remember lots of people got excited when Biden said "Inshallah" during one of the presidential debates, and look where that's, what has that meant? Nothing. Like, he's not stopped giving money to Israel, not condemned them, nothing. If anything, the damage he has done is, if more, or at the very least, the exact same as it would have been if it had been Trump or any other president in charge in these last 4 years in the likes of Palestine.
Absolutely. SubhanAllah. Yeah.
This is maybe a good time then to wrap it up. It feels like we covered a lot anyway. I think, for me anyway, the main takeaway with this is there is a huge rich history here, not only about the Palestinians, Palestine as a land, as a culture, but also Zionism, which is really important to understand, especially for us as Muslims, but for anyone as well. This it's a very, very dangerous ideology that's very much deeply rooted in European colonial history, and Orientalism history. So, unfortunately, we're seeing that it's a difficult thing to even speak out against, especially now. It's been in the likes of the US, the UK, especially. The approach is very totalitarian if you try and speak out in any way against it. But it's the only way for us. I suppose the unfortunately little things that we can do in our position is to try and educate those around us, and anyone who listens or watches this podcast as well, on why this region is so important historically, and of course where this root ideology of Zionism comes from, and the effect it's had not only on Palestinians but even Judaism and the Jewish people in this day and age.
Actually, maybe we didn't touch on that point so much, on perhaps the negative effect that Zionism has had on Jews and Judaism as a faith, because it really has co-opted this great kind of culture. At least within Europe, you really had a very deep engagement with philosophy and humanist thinking that Jews very much contributed to. And of course, in Arab lands, Jews were part and parcel of the tapestry of each region's kind of local culture and local traditions and what have you. And Zionism just completely, tore that fabric apart. The moment Israel was established, you had the lives of hundreds of thousands of Jews across the Arab world turn upside down, because immediately a mark was put on their backs due to the fact that they were Jews, and Israel claimed that it was a nation for the Jews and that it was established in order to gather in the Jewish people of the world. The majority of these Arab Jews, and I use this term, by the way, but Zionists very much dislike it. These Arab Jews, their lives were torn apart, and they had no choice in this. Many of them had nothing to do with Zionism, and they had no interest in this philosophy. It was a European ideology that emerged out of a European context of extreme persecution of Jewish people. That was not the context of most Arab Jews, and unfortunately, Zionism forced itself upon them in 1948, and they found themselves exiled from homelands where they probably existed for hundreds of years. And so it really tore apart a very rich Jewish tradition in the Muslim world. And we've talked about this before, Zan. We mentioned that when we look at the history of Islam, it makes far more sense far more sense to speak of a Judeo-Islamic civilization and tradition than it does to speak of a Judeo-Christian civilization. It's a Judeo-Christian civilization that only really emerged in the wake of the Holocaust, in this attempt by Christians to resolve the issue, whereas Judeo-Islamic civilization, we can really speak of a philosophical and cultural and other form of tradition. That was all torn apart by Zionism, and this is a tragedy we really do have to recognize. Maybe we can speak about it another time. I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Definitely, one that often doesn't get highlighted, and often Muslims are the ones that are blamed for having animosity towards Jews, Jewish people, the Jewish faith, and so on. When Holocaust had nothing to do with Islam, nothing to do with Muslims. This creation of Israel had nothing to do with Muslims. And yeah, as you said, naturally, when you have this state that's causing problems for natives and then labels itself as ethno-Jewish state, you're going to cause issues in other parts, not too far from there as well, other areas, where previously there was historically no issues. Certainly not to the extent that Jews have faced in Europe, in fact.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, the Zafal Khair to you both. I think this was a really good discussion. I think, especially given that things unfortunately are continuing to escalate in Palestine, it's worth mentioning that we of course keep them in our du'as, pray for their safety, their success, and ultimately their justice and their victory, and that the graves are widened, and that those that have died have been are granted the deaths of martyrs and Jannatul for those, inshallah. And it's a bit of an unfortunately sad note, but such is the state of the situation. But Jazakallah khair for all of you for listening or watching, and hope you enjoyed this episode and found it interesting. And see you on the next one, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.